A cowboy. With a cracked rib whispered, "It hurts." She said, "Then let me hold you till it doesn't." Montana Territory, 1875. A young cowboy lies bleeding behind a boulder, his rib shattered by a bullet meant to silence him forever. He witnessed a murder, and now killers hunt him across the open prairie. But when a copper-haired healer appears in a wagon, she doesn't run from the gunfire. She rides straight into it. What begins as a desperate rescue becomes something neither of them expected, a love forged in blood, courage, and the unforgiving frontier. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the Montana prairie, turning the golden grass into waves of amber and rust. Caleb Arden pressed his back against the boulder, every breath a knife through his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers where he clutched his left side, warm and sticky against his shirt. The world tilted and swayed, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of dirt and sky. "He went behind them rocks!" a voice shouted from somewhere beyond the ridge. Caleb's jaw clenched. 3 of them. Maybe 4. He'd lost count after the first shot cracked through the air and sent him diving from his horse. The animal had bolted, taking his rifle with it, leaving him with nothing but a half-empty revolver and rapidly fading strength. He'd known running would come to this, known it the moment he'd ridden away from the Triple J Ranch 3 days ago, the image of what he'd witnessed still burning behind his eyelids. Samuel Pritchard, his boss, standing over the bodies of a Cheyenne family, a man, a woman, 2 children, their blood dark on the prairie grass. Pritchard had looked up, seen Caleb on the ridge, and smiled. That smile had been worse than the gunshot. "Spread out," another voice called. "He's hit. Can't have gone far." Caleb tried to steady his breathing, but each inhale felt like his ribs were grinding against each other. The bullet had caught him just below his left armpit, a glancing blow that had nevertheless cracked bone. He could feel it, that sickening wrongness inside his chest, like something had come loose and was floating where it shouldn't be. He peered around the edge of the boulder. 3 riders fanned out across the plain, their horses moving at a careful walk. They were in no hurry. They knew he was cornered. The one in the middle was Ray Jessup, Pritchard's foreman, a man with dead eyes and hands that had broken more than a few bones over the years. To his left rode Tom Bigelow, young and eager to prove himself. On the right, Dutch Carver, who never spoke but always smiled, even when he was beating a man senseless. Caleb checked his revolver, 3 rounds left, against 3 armed men on horseback, with open ground in every direction. His hand shook as he thumbed back the hammer. "Arden," Jessup's voice carried across the prairie, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. The boss just wants to talk." Caleb would have laughed if it wouldn't have hurt so much. Talk. Right. The way Pritchard had talked to that Cheyenne family. He closed his eyes, trying to think through the pain. The nearest town was Cold Creek, maybe 15 miles northeast. He'd never make it on foot, not with a cracked rib and 3 killers on his trail. His only chance was to hold them off until dark, then try to slip away. But dark was hours away, and he could feel his strength bleeding out with every heartbeat. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer. They were circling, tightening the noose. Caleb raised the revolver, steadied it against the rock. His vision swam. He blinked hard, trying to focus. Then he heard it. A different sound cutting through the thunder in his ears. Wagon wheels. Creaking wood and the jingle of harness. He risked another look around the boulder. Coming from the east, moving at a steady pace across the prairie, was a covered wagon pulled by 2 dun horses. The driver sat straight-backed on the bench, hat pulled low, face hidden in shadow. "Well now," Jessup said, pulling his horse to a stop. "Looks like we got ourselves a witness." Caleb's stomach dropped. No, not this. Whoever was on that wagon had just rolled into the middle of an execution. The wagon kept coming, not slowing, not turning aside. As it drew closer, Caleb could make out more details. The canvas cover was patched, but clean. Supplies were lashed tight to the sides. And the driver was a woman. She couldn't have been more than 25, with copper hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her face was sun-touched and sharp-featured, her eyes the color of creek water under shade. She wore a simple brown dress covered by a leather duster that had seen better days. She pulled the wagon to a stop 30 yards from the boulder, right between Caleb and the three riders. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she called out, her voice clear and steady. "Seems like I picked a busy stretch of prairie." Jessup walked his horse toward her, his hand resting casual-like on his gun belt. "Ma'am, you should probably keep moving. This here's private business." "Private business that involves shooting at an unarmed man?" The woman tilted her head. "Because from where I'm sitting, that looks like attempted murder." Caleb stared. Was she insane? "Ma'am," Jessup's voice hardened. "I'm a healer," the woman interrupted, wrapping the reins around the brake handle. "Been traveling from Fort Benton. Saw your gunfire from about 2 miles back." She gestured toward Caleb's boulder. "That man hurt?" "That ain't your concern. Actually, it is." She climbed down from the wagon with the easy confidence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "I took an oath. See a person in need, I help. Simple as that." Bigelow laughed, a nervous sound. "Lady, you got about 5 seconds to get back on that wagon before—" "Before what?" She turned to face him directly. "Before you shoot me too? In broad daylight? On the territorial road?" She shook her head. "I don't think so. See, that surveying team about 3 miles back? They saw your horses, and I made sure to tell them I was heading this way to investigate gunshots. They'll remember me. They'll remember my wagon." It was a bluff. Caleb could hear it in the slight tremor beneath her words, could see it in the way her hands stayed carefully visible and empty. But it was a good bluff. Jessup's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe." She moved toward the boulder, slowly, her hands still in plain sight. "But I'm making it anyway." "Stop right there," Jessup growled. She stopped, but she didn't back down. "I'm going to check on that man. You can ride away, or you can explain to a federal marshal why you shot a healer on a public road. Your choice." The silence stretched out, broken only by the prairie wind and the creak of saddle leather as Dutch Carver shifted his weight. Caleb held his breath, his gun still raised, watching the standoff unfold. Finally, Jessup spat into the dirt. "This ain't over, Arden. You hear me? Pritchard's got a long reach." He wheeled his horse around, the other two following. But before they rode off, Jessup looked back at the woman. "You just made yourself an enemy, lady. Remember that." "I'll add it to the list," she said quietly. They rode away at a canter, dust rising in their wake. The woman waited until they crested the far ridge before she moved again, walking quickly around the boulder. She stopped short when she saw Caleb, her eyes taking in the blood, the gun, the gray cast to his skin. "Holy hell," she breathed. "You look terrible." Caleb tried to answer, but the world chose that moment to tilt sideways. His gun slipped from his fingers, and he felt himself falling, the boulder at his back no longer enough to hold him upright. The woman lunged forward, catching him before he hit the ground. Her arms were stronger than he expected, her hands sure and steady as she lowered him onto his back. Hey, stay with me." She pressed her palm against his wounded side, and Caleb sucked in a sharp breath. "I know it hurts. I know. But I need you conscious. Can you do that for me?" He managed a nod, focusing on her face. Up close, he could see a small scar above her left eyebrow, a dusting of freckles across her nose. Her eyes were urgent, but not panicked. "What's your name?" she asked, already unbuttoning his shirt with quick, efficient movements. "Caleb," he managed. "Caleb Arden." "All right, Caleb Arden. I'm Marin Hale, and I'm going to get you into my wagon, but first I need to see how bad this is." She pulled back the blood-soaked fabric and hissed through her teeth. "Bullet wound. Looks like it caught your rib." "Cracked," he gasped. "Can feel it." "I bet you can." She was already moving, pulling supplies from her pockets. Bandages, a small bottle of something that smelled like alcohol and sage. "This is going to hurt worse before it gets better. Ready?" "Do I—" He coughed, tasted copper. "Have a choice?" "Not really." She poured liquid over the wound, and Caleb's vision went white. He heard himself cry out, felt her hand grip his shoulder. "Breathe," she commanded. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. Again." He obeyed, dragging air into his lungs despite the agony lancing through his chest. Slowly, the world came back into focus. Marin was wrapping bandages around his torso, her movements practiced and sure. You're good at this, he managed. I'd better be. Spent 2 years apprentice to a doctor in St. Louis before I came west. She tied off the bandage, then sat back on her heels, studying him. You gonna tell me why those men were trying to kill you? Caleb met her eyes. In them, he saw no judgment, only a frank curiosity mixed with concern. I saw something I shouldn't have, he said quietly. And now I'm a loose end. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Well then, lucky for you, I'm headed to Cold Creek. Town's about 15 miles northeast. I'm the new midwife there, or I will be once I actually arrive. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. Think you can make it to the wagon, or do I need to drag you? I can walk. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But when she slipped her arm under his shoulders and helped him to his feet, he gritted his teeth and took one step, then another. The world swayed dangerously, but Marin's grip was iron strong. That's it, she murmured. Just a few more yards. They made it to the wagon, though Caleb couldn't have said how. His legs felt like water, his chest like someone had packed it with broken glass. Marin lowered the tailgate and helped him climb inside, where he collapsed onto a pile of blankets that smelled like lavender and wood smoke. Lie still, she ordered, arranging the blankets around him. And don't you dare die on me, Caleb Arden. I didn't bluff my way past 3 gunmen just to lose you to blood loss. Yes, ma'am, he whispered. She paused, her hand gentle on his forehead, checking for fever. For a moment, her expression softened. You're safe now. Rest. Then she was gone, the tailgate creaking shut, her footsteps moving toward the front of the wagon. Caleb heard her climb onto the bench, heard the snap of reins and the creak of wheels as they lurched into motion. The wagon's movement sent fresh waves of pain through his chest, but beneath it, Caleb felt something else, a fragile, unexpected hope. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him. When Caleb woke, the light had changed. Late afternoon had given way to dusk, painting the canvas wagon cover in shades of purple and gold. The wheels still rumbled beneath him, and every jolt sent a spike of pain through his ribs, but the bleeding had stopped. He could tell from the way his bandages felt, tight and dry rather than wet. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Stay down, Marin's voice called from the front. We're still about 5 miles out from Cold Creek. You can suffer through lying still for another hour. Caleb eased back onto the blankets, staring up at the wagon's arched frame. You always this bossy with people you just met? Only the ones who get shot saving evidence of murder. There was a pause. That is what happened, isn't it? You saw someone killed. He should have been surprised that she'd put it together so quickly, but somehow he wasn't. This woman had stared down 3 armed men without flinching. She was clearly sharper than most. A family, he said quietly. Cheyenne, a mother, father, 2 little girls. My boss, Samuel Pritchard. He wanted their land. They wouldn't sell, so he... The word stuck in his throat. So he killed them, Marin finished, her voice flat. And you saw it. Yeah. And instead of killing you right there, he sent men to hunt you down. Why? Caleb frowned. It was a good question, one he'd been too busy running to consider properly. Don't know. Maybe he thought I'd run scared, keep my mouth shut. Or maybe he wanted it to look like an accident, something that couldn't be traced back to him. Makes sense. Man like that doesn't get to run a big ranch by being stupid. The wagon slowed as they navigated a rough patch of ground. So what's your plan? Keep running? Hide? Caleb realized he didn't have a plan, not beyond staying alive for the next day, the next hour. I need to get word to the territorial marshal. If I can testify, maybe Pritchard goes to prison. Or maybe his lawyers tie it up in court for years while his hired guns keep hunting you. Marin's voice wasn't cruel, just pragmatic. You need more than testimony, Caleb. You need leverage. What kind of leverage? Evidence? Witnesses? Something that makes you more dangerous dead than alive. The wagon rolled on for a moment before she spoke again. Cold Creek has a telegraph office and a sheriff, though he's barely worth the tin badge they gave him. But it's a start. You can send messages, make noise, let people know what Pritchard did. Make yourself visible enough that killing you becomes a liability instead of a solution. Caleb absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. She was right. Running would only buy him time, and not much of it. He needed to go on the offensive somehow. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. "You don't know me, don't owe me anything." The wagon fell silent except for the creak of wheels and the steady clip-clop of hooves. When Marin finally answered, her voice was softer, more distant. 5 years ago, my brother saw a man get beaten to death outside a saloon in Kansas. He went to the law, testified, did everything right. And a week later, they found him in an alley with his throat cut. She paused. The killers walked free because there was no other witness. No one else would step forward. Everyone was too scared. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just stay alive. And when the time comes, you tell the truth, no matter how scared you are. You do that, and maybe my brother's death means something." Caleb felt the weight of her words settle over him like a mantle. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice, the kind that actually meant something. "I'll tell the truth," he promised, "no matter what." "Good." Marin's voice brightened slightly. "Now get some rest. You're going to need your strength." Caleb closed his eyes, but sleep was elusive. Through gaps in the canvas, he could see stars beginning to emerge in the deepening sky. The Big Dipper hung low on the northern horizon, the North Star steady and unchanging. His father had taught him to navigate by those stars when he was just a boy. "Long as you can see the North Star," his father had said, "you're never truly lost." But his father had been dead for 10 years now, killed in a mining accident that probably could have been prevented if the company had cared more about safety than profit. His mother had followed a year later, her heart giving out under the weight of grief and poverty. Caleb had been 17 when he'd signed on with the Triple J Ranch, desperate for work that paid. Pritchard had seemed like a fair boss back then, stern but honest. It had taken years for Caleb to see the truth, that Pritchard's fairness only extended to those who were useful to him, and his honesty was just another mask he wore when it suited him. The wagon hit a rut, jostling Caleb back to the present. He winced, pressing a hand to his bandaged ribs. "Sorry," Marin called back. "Road gets rough here." "It's fine," he gritted out. But it wasn't fine. None of this was fine. He was wounded, hunted, dependent on the kindness of a stranger who had no good reason to risk her life for him. And even if they made it to Cold Creek, even if he sent his telegrams and made his noise, there was no guarantee it would be enough. Pritchard had money, connections, influence. What did Caleb have? A story and a cracked rib. The darkness pressed in around him, heavy with doubt and pain. Then Marin's voice cut through it, singing softly. An old hymn, the kind Caleb's mother used to hum while she worked. "Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy, never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise." Her voice wasn't perfect, a little rough around the edges, sometimes missing the higher notes, but it was real, honest. It reminded Caleb of everything good in the world, everything worth fighting for. He let the song wash over him, and slowly, finally, he drifted into a dreamless sleep. He woke to the sound of voices and the wagon coming to a halt. Lamplight flickered through the canvas, casting dancing shadows. "Don't care if you're the new midwife or the Queen of England, ma'am. It's past 10 o'clock. Respectable folks are in bed." "Then it's lucky I'm not respectable." That was Marin, her voice sharp with irritation. "I've got an injured man in my wagon who needs a proper bed and medical attention. You going to help or just stand there looking official?" A sigh. "Who's injured?" "Name's Caleb Arden. He was shot by—" "I don't need his life story, ma'am. Just need to know if he's dangerous." "Only to people who shoot at innocent families." Another pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means exactly what I said, Sheriff. Now, are you going to help me get him inside, or do I need to drag him myself?" All right. No need to get tetchy." Heavy footsteps approached the wagon. "Let me see him." The tailgate opened, and Caleb squinted against the sudden brightness of a lantern. A man's face swam into view, middle-aged, with a graying beard and eyes that had seen too much and cared about too little. "Can you walk, son?" the sheriff asked. "I can try," Caleb said. With Marin on one side and the sheriff on the other, they managed to get him out of the wagon and onto his feet. The world spun sickeningly, but Caleb locked his knees and held on. Cold Creek at night was a scatter of wooden buildings along a single main street. Lamplight glowed in a few windows. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The air smelled like wood smoke and horses. "Where are we taking him?" the sheriff asked. "My place," Marin said. "The old midwife's cabin. Mrs. Thornton wrote that it comes with the position." "That shack hasn't been lived in for 6 months. It'll be a mess. Then I'll clean it." Marin's tone left no room for argument. "Let's move." They half-walked, half-dragged Caleb down the street to a small cabin set back from the main road. True to the sheriff's word, it looked abandoned. Shutters hanging crooked, porch boards warped, weeds growing tall around the foundation. But inside, once Marin got a lamp lit, it wasn't as bad as Caleb had feared. One main room with a fireplace, a small bedroom off to the side, a lean-to shed out back. Dusty, yes, but structurally sound. They lowered Caleb onto a narrow bed in the corner. He sank into the mattress with a groan of relief. "I'll need to check those bandages," Marin said, already moving toward her medical supplies. "Sheriff, if you wouldn't mind bringing in my bags from the wagon—" "I'll do it in the morning," the sheriff interrupted. "Right now, I need to know what's really going on here. Who shot this man?" Caleb and Marin exchanged glances. This was it. The moment where they either trusted the law or didn't. Caleb took a shallow breath and made his choice. Samuel Pritchard's men, Ray Jessup, Tom Bigelow, and Dutch Carver. They were trying to kill me. The sheriff's expression didn't change. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." "Why would Pritchard want you dead?" "Because I saw him murder a Cheyenne family 3 days ago. A man named Running Bear, his wife, and their 2 daughters. Pritchard wanted their land for grazing rights. They refused to sell, so he shot them." Now the sheriff's face did change, a flicker of something that might have been fear crossing his features before he locked it down. "You got any proof of this?" "I saw it with my own eyes." "That ain't proof, son. That's just your word against one of the richest men in the territory." "Then I'll testify under oath. I'll go to the territorial marshal, the federal authorities, whoever will listen, and you'll end up dead in a ditch before you make it 10 miles. The sheriff shook his head. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw. I know what I saw," Caleb said, his voice hardening. "And if you're too scared of Pritchard to do your job, then say so. Don't insult me by pretending I'm crazy or mistaken." The sheriff's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he stared at Caleb with an expression that was equal parts anger and shame. Then he turned to Marin. "You believe him?" he asked quietly. "I believe 3 armed men were trying to kill him for a reason," Marin said. "And I believe a man with nothing to gain and everything to lose wouldn't make up a story like this." The sheriff nodded slowly, a decision forming behind his eyes. "All right. Here's what's going to happen. You," he pointed at Caleb, "stay out of sight for a few days while you heal. Don't go wandering around town, don't talk to folks, don't make yourself a target. Let people think you moved on or died or whatever. And you," he turned to Marin, "you're just the new midwife. You found an injured drifter on the road, patched him up, dropped him in Cold Creek. That's the story." "Why?" Marin asked. "Because if Pritchard thinks Caleb's dead or gone, he might get careless, might let something slip. And in the meantime, I'll send a quiet telegram to the territorial marshal's office. See what they know about Pritchard." He held up a hand before Caleb could protest. "It ain't much, but it's something. And it keeps you alive long enough to maybe get some real justice." It wasn't what Caleb wanted. He wanted to shout from the rooftops, to drag Pritchard into the light and make him face what he'd done. But Marin's hand found his, squeezed gently, and he understood. Stay alive. That was step 1. Everything else came after. "All right," Caleb said. "We do it your way." The sheriff nodded, satisfied. "I'll bring Miss Hale's bags in the morning. For now, get some rest, both of you." He left, pulling the door shut behind him. His footsteps faded into the night. Marin immediately moved to Caleb's side, unwrapping the blood-stained bandages with gentle efficiency. "Let me see how you're doing." The wound looked better than Caleb had expected. Angry and red, but not infected. Marin cleaned it again with her sharp-smelling tincture, then applied a poultice that felt cool against his burning skin. "You're lucky," she said. "Another inch to the right, and that bullet would have punctured your lung. Another inch lower and it might have hit your liver. You got the best possible bad outcome. Doesn't feel lucky. I know. She finished rewrapping the bandages, her movements sure and practiced. But you're alive, and as long as you're alive, there's hope. Caleb studied her in the lamplight. This woman who had appeared out of nowhere and saved his life, who had bluffed armed killers and faced down a reluctant sheriff, who was now tending his wounds like it was the most natural thing in the world. Why are you really doing this? He asked softly. Your brother, I understand that. But this is more than just keeping a promise to a dead man. Marin was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling on the bandages. When she finally looked up, her Creekwater eyes were distant, haunted. When I was training in St. Louis, there was a woman who came to the clinic. She'd been beaten by her husband, not the first time from the look of her. The doctor treated her injuries, told her to leave the man. She said she couldn't, that she had nowhere to go. Marin's voice dropped to barely a whisper. 2 weeks later, they found her body in the river. The husband said she'd fallen, that it was an accident. Everyone knew he was lying, but no one did anything. No one wanted to get involved. She looked down at her hands, at the blood staining the bandages. I swore then that I would never be that person. The one who looks away because it's easier, safer. If I can help, I help. It's as simple as that. It's not simple, Caleb said. You could have been killed today. So could you, but we weren't. She met his eyes, and for the first time since they'd met, she smiled. A small, tired smile that nonetheless lit her entire face. And now you're going to live long enough to make Pritchard pay for what he did. That's worth the risk. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, something that had nothing to do with his cracked rib. Looking at Marin Hale, seeing the fierce determination and gentle compassion warring in her expression, he felt a pull unlike anything he'd experienced before. It was more than gratitude, more than simple attraction. It was recognition, the soul-deep knowledge that this woman, this stranger who had ridden into his life at his darkest moment, was going to change everything. Thank you, he said, inadequate as the words were. You're welcome. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. Now, get some sleep. I'm going to try to make this place halfway livable before morning. Marine? She turned back. I'm going to make this right, he promised. For your brother. For that Cheyenne family. For everyone Pritchard has hurt. I swear it. Her smile widened just a fraction. I know you will, Caleb Arden. I can see it in you. Then she was moving through the cabin, lighting more lamps, opening shutters, filling the space with purpose and light. And Caleb, exhausted and aching, but somehow more hopeful than he'd been in days, let himself drift back to sleep. Outside, the prairie night sang its ancient song, coyotes calling, wind rustling through grass, stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. And in a small cabin in Cold Creek, two people who had been strangers that morning began the slow, uncertain work of trust. Neither of them knew it yet, but the ripples from this day would spread wider than they could imagine. Justice would be served, yes, but only after blood and fire and a love neither of them saw coming. For now, though, they simply endured. And on the frontier, sometimes endurance was the bravest thing of all. The lamp burned low as Marin worked, casting long shadows across the walls. And in those shadows, watching from the darkness beyond the windows, Cold Creek held its breath and waited to see what would come next. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the cabin's dusty windows, painting stripes across the rough wooden floor. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, the homely scent so unexpected that for a moment he thought he was dreaming. Then his ribs reminded him otherwise, sending a sharp lance of pain through his chest as he tried to sit up. Easy, Marin's voice came from across the room. She stood at the small stove, tending a skillet with the same practiced efficiency she brought to everything. Her copper hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the morning light. You move like that, and you'll tear something open. Caleb eased back against the thin pillow, breathing carefully. How long was I out? About 10 hours. It's nearly 7. She brought over a tin plate loaded with eggs and bacon, along with a steaming cup of coffee. Eat. You need to rebuild your strength. The food was simple but good, and Caleb realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. 2 days ago? 3? The flight from Pritchard's ranch had been a blur of fear and adrenaline. Where'd you get all this? he asked between bites. Sheriff brought my bags over at dawn, along with some supplies from the general store on credit, since apparently the town council authorized a stipend for the midwife. She poured herself coffee and sat in the cabin's only chair, a rickety ladderback that creaked under her weight. He also said 3 strangers rode through town last night asking about a wounded man. He told them he hadn't seen anyone matching that description. Caleb's hand stilled halfway to his mouth. Jessup and his boys. Probably. They didn't push it, just moved on, but they'll be back. Marin sipped her coffee, her expression thoughtful. The sheriff also mentioned that Samuel Pritchard owns about half the county, including the bank and most of the grazing land. People are scared of him. With good reason. Caleb set down his plate, appetite fading. I worked for him 3 years, saw him ruin men who crossed him. One rancher wouldn't sell his water rights, so Pritchard had his cattle poisoned, made it look like disease. Another time, a homesteader filed a legal complaint about fence lines. His barn burned down a week later. And no one stopped him? Who's going to stop him? He pays the sheriff's salary, owns the newspaper, has judges and territorial officials in his pocket. Caleb stared into his coffee. That Cheyenne family, they weren't the first, just the first time I saw it happen with my own eyes. Marin was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. My brother used to say that evil flourishes when good people stay silent. I didn't really understand what he meant until after he died. Until I saw how everyone just accepted it. Accepted that killers could walk free, that justice was only for people with money and power. Your brother was right, Caleb said softly. Yes, he was. She stood abruptly, setting her cup down with a decisive clink, which is why we're not staying silent. But first, we need to make sure you live long enough to testify. That means you're staying in this cabin until those ribs heal enough for you to ride if we need to run. I can't just hide here. People will ask questions. Let them ask. I'll tell them you moved on, like the sheriff suggested. She began clearing the breakfast dishes. In the meantime, there's a shed out back that needs repairs. Tools are there, materials too. When you're feeling stronger, and not before, you can make yourself useful. Give you something to do besides brood. Caleb wanted to argue, but the exhaustion weighing down his limbs told him she was right. He wasn't in any shape to ride, let alone fight. How long do you think it'll take for my ribs to heal? If the fracture is clean and you don't do anything stupid, 4 to 6 weeks before you're anywhere near full strength, 2 weeks minimum before you can ride without passing out from pain. She looked at him over her shoulder, one eyebrow raised. Think you can manage that long without getting yourself killed? I'll try. That's all I ask. She finished with the dishes, then pulled a worn leather journal from one of her bags. Now, I need to let people know I'm here and open for business, which means I'll be out making calls most of the day. You stay inside, keep the door locked, and don't answer if anyone knocks. Understand? Yes, ma'am. Something in his tone made her smile. You don't have to call me ma'am. Marin is fine. Marin, he repeated, and liked the way her name felt in his mouth. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then looked away, color rising in her cheeks. Right, well, I'll be back by evening. Try not to bleed on anything. Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Caleb alone in the quiet cabin with nothing but his thoughts and the dull ache in his chest. The day crawled by with painful slowness. Caleb dozed fitfully, drank water, and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong. Every sound from outside made him tense. Boots on the porch, voices passing by, the rattle of a wagon. But no one knocked. No one tried the door. By late afternoon, restlessness drove him to his feet despite Marin's warnings. He moved carefully to the window, peering out through a gap in the curtains. Cold Creek in daylight looked like a dozen other frontier towns Caleb had seen, a scattering of false-fronted buildings, a church with a modest steeple, corrals and stables at the edge of town. People moved about their business with the unhurried pace of those who lived far from anywhere important. And yet, beneath that ordinary surface, Caleb could sense the tension, the way people glanced over their shoulders, the conversations that stopped when strangers approached. This was a town that had learned to be careful, to keep its head down, a town that had learned to survive under Samuel Pritchard's shadow. Movement caught his eye. A woman emerging from the general store, followed by 2 small children. She looked harried, carrying too many parcels, trying to keep the children from running into the street. Without thinking, Caleb felt a pang of memory. The Cheyenne mother had looked like that in the moment before Pritchard drew his gun. Harried, tired, protective, human. Caleb turned away from the window, his jaw tight. 4 to 6 weeks, Marin had said. It felt like an eternity. But he would wait. He would heal, and then he would make sure that Mother and her children never had to fear Samuel Pritchard again. The door opened just as twilight was falling, and Marin slipped inside carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She looked tired, but satisfied. "How was your first day as Cold Creek's midwife?" Caleb asked. "Productive. Met about a dozen families, checked on 2 pregnant women and 1 with a newborn." She set the basket on the table and began unpacking. Fresh bread, a jar of preserves, some apples. "Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house sent this, said it was a welcome gift." "That was kind of her." "It was strategic," Marin corrected, though her tone was warm. "She wanted to make sure I knew her daughter is 5 months along with her first baby. Wanted to book my services in advance." She glanced at him. "How are you feeling? You look less gray than this morning." "I'm fine. Restless." "That's a good sign. Means your body's starting to recover." She cut slices of bread and spread preserves, handing him one. "Tomorrow, if you're up for it, you can take a look at that shed. Doors hanging off its hinges and the roof leaks. If you're going to hide here, might as well make yourself useful." They ate in companionable silence, the day's tension slowly unwinding. Outside, Cold Creek settled into evening, lamplight appearing in windows, the distant sound of someone playing a fiddle, dogs barking their twilight chorus. "Tell me about your family," Marin said suddenly. "You know about my brother, but I don't know anything about you." Caleb swallowed his bite of bread, considering. "Not much to tell. My father died in a mine collapse when I was 17. My mother followed a year later. Heart just gave out, the doctor said, but I think she died of grief." He stared at his hands, at the calluses and scars that mapped his years of hard labor. "I've been on my own since then. Worked ranches, cattle drives, whatever paid. Ended up at Pritchard's place 3 years ago." "No siblings?" "Had a sister, younger. She died of scarlet fever when she was 6. The memory was old enough that it no longer cut quite as deep, but it still ached. I barely remember her, just flashes, her laugh, the way she used to follow me everywhere." "I'm sorry," Marin said softly. "It's all right. Was a long time ago." He met her eyes. "What about you? Any other family besides your brother?" Her expression closed slightly, like a door being gently shut. "No. Our parents died of cholera when I was 15, and Thomas was 19. We had each other, at least for a while." She stood, began clearing the dishes. "Then I had no one. So I threw myself into learning healing. Figured if I couldn't save the people I loved, at least I could save strangers." There was a world of pain in those words, a grief that mirrored Caleb's own. He understood, suddenly, why she had risked everything for him. It wasn't just about justice or keeping promises. It was about refusing to be helpless again. "You did save me," he said quietly. "You know that, right? If you hadn't come along when you did, but I did come along, and you're alive. That's what matters." She turned to face him, her expression fierce. "And you're going to stay alive, Caleb Arden, long enough to see Pritchard answer for what he did. I won't accept anything less." The intensity in her voice sent a shock through him, something electric and undeniable. In the lamplight, with her copper hair loose and her eyes blazing with determination, Marin Hale was the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen, and the most terrifying, because he was starting to realize that his life was now bound to hers in ways that went far beyond gratitude or circumstance. She had saved him, yes, but more than that, she had given him something to fight for beyond mere survival. She had given him hope. "I promise," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'll stay alive." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her dishes. And Caleb, watching her move through the small cabin with quiet confidence, felt the first fragile stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years, the sense that he might actually have a future worth living. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings, Marin would tend to Caleb's wounds, changing bandages and checking for signs of infection. Then she would head out into Cold Creek, making her rounds, delivering medicines, checking on expectant mothers. And Caleb, once he could move without wanting to scream, would work on the shed. The repairs gave him purpose, something to focus on beyond the constant gnawing fear. He replaced the rotted door frame, patched the leaking roof with spare shingles, reinforced the foundation where weather and neglect had taken their toll. The work was slow and painful, each hammer blow sending echoes through his cracked ribs, but it was also strangely satisfying. He was building something, making something whole that had been broken. Evenings were the best part of the day. Marin would return as the sun was setting, and they would share whatever simple meal they could cobble together. Then, as the night deepened, they would talk. Caleb learned that Marin had grown up in Ohio, that her favorite season was autumn, that she could play the piano but hadn't touched one in years. He learned that she was terrified of thunderstorms because of a tornado that had nearly destroyed her childhood home. He learned that she read voraciously, medical texts, poetry, novels, anything she could get her hands on, and that she had a sharp, dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh despite everything. And in turn, he told her things he'd never told anyone, about the nightmares that still woke him sometimes, full of his father's screams as the mine collapsed, about the guilt he carried for surviving when so many others hadn't, about the way working with horses made him feel peaceful in a way nothing else did, how their simple honesty and lack of pretense was a balm to his soul. "You should have your own place someday," Marin said one night, about a week into his stay. They were sitting on the cabin's small porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "A ranch of your own, raise horses, maybe some cattle. Build something that's yours." "That's a nice dream," Caleb said. "Not sure it's a realistic one for a wanted man." "You won't be wanted forever, once Pritchard's arrested, once you testify." "If he's arrested. If I testify." Caleb shook his head. "Marin, you've seen this town. You've seen how scared everyone is. Even the sheriff is hedging his bets, playing both sides. What makes you think anything will change?" "Because it has to," she said simply. "Because the alternative is living in fear forever, and that's not living at all." He wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to. But 3 years working for Pritchard had taught him that power protected power, and men like his former boss rarely faced consequences. "You're an optimist," he said. "I'm a realist," she corrected. "I know how bad things are, but I also know that change is possible. It just requires people willing to stand up and demand it." She turned to look at him, her profile sharp against the darkening sky. "My brother stood up, and yes, it got him killed. But his death wasn't meaningless. It taught me that silence is complicity, that if you want the world to be better, you have to be willing to fight for it, even when the odds are stacked against you." Caleb studied her, this woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. "You're either very brave or very foolish. Can't I be both?" He laughed, the sound startling him. When was the last time he'd laughed? "Yeah, I suppose you can." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the prairie night. A coyote called in the distance, lonely and haunting. The fireflies continued their silent dance, tiny sparks of life in the vast darkness. "Caleb," Marin said softly, "when this is over, when Pritchard's in prison and you're free, what will you do?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Haven't let myself think that far ahead." "Maybe you should. Maybe having something to look forward to, some goal beyond just surviving, would help." She had a point. Caleb closed his eyes, tried to imagine a future where he wasn't running, wasn't afraid. What would that look like? A ranch, maybe? Somewhere quiet, far from the machinations of men like Pritchard. A small house with a good well and fertile land, horses grazing in the fields, and maybe... He opened his eyes and found Marin watching him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Maybe," he said carefully, "maybe I'd want someone to share it with. Someone brave enough to face down killers, stubborn enough to save a stranger, and foolish enough to think the world can change." Her breath caught, just slightly. "That's a very specific description." "Is it?" The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. Caleb's heart was pounding, and it had nothing to do with his healing ribs. Marin stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. I should check your bandages before bed. Make sure everything's healing properly. The moment shattered, but its echo remained. Caleb followed her inside, acutely aware of how small the cabin was, how every movement brought them within inches of each other. She worked in silence, her fingers gentle as she unwrapped the old bandages and examined his wound. It was healing well. The angry red had faded to pink, and the swelling had gone down significantly. "You're lucky," she murmured, applying fresh salve. "No infection, no complications. Another week or two, and you'll be almost good as new." "Marin, don't." She tied off the new bandages with quick, efficient movements. "Don't say whatever you're about to say. Not yet. Not while you're still in danger, while everything is so uncertain." "Why not?" She finally looked up at him, and he saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of Pritchard or his men, but fear of something else entirely. "Because I can't afford to hope for things that might not happen. Because if I let myself want something, truly want it, and then lose it..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I've lost too many people already, Caleb. I can't lose anyone else." Understanding flooded through him. She was protecting herself, building walls against the possibility of more grief. He couldn't blame her. He'd done the same thing for years. But now, looking at her in the lamplight, seeing the vulnerability beneath her fierce exterior, Caleb realized he was tired of those walls. Tired of living half a life, always holding back, always afraid to want anything beyond the next sunrise. "You won't lose me," he said quietly. "I promise you that." "You can't promise that. No one can." "Then I'll promise to try. To fight with everything I have to make sure we both get through this." He caught her hand, held it gently. "I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. But Marin, you saved my life, and now I can't imagine..." She pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping the words. "Not yet," she whispered. "Please, let's just take this one day at a time. Can we do that?" It wasn't what he wanted, but it was enough. For now. "One day at a time," he agreed. She nodded, withdrew her hand, and retreated to her small bedroom. Caleb settled onto his bedroll in the main room, listening to the soft sounds of her preparing for sleep. One day at a time. He could do that. He could be patient. But he also knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that Marin Hale had become as essential to him as breathing. And when this was over, when Pritchard was brought to justice and the danger had passed, he would tell her so. He would tell her everything. Another week slipped by, marked by the slow, steady progress of healing. Caleb's ribs hurt less each day. His breathing came easier. His strength returned in increments. The shed was nearly finished, transformed from a collapsing wreck into something sturdy and useful. He'd even started on repairs to the cabin itself, fixing the warped porch boards, replacing cracked window panes, reinforcing the chimney. Marin pretended not to notice how the cabin was becoming more of a home with each passing day. She focused on her work, delivering 2 babies in one exhausting 36-hour stretch, treating a farmhand who'd broken his arm, and helping a young woman through a difficult miscarriage that left everyone shaken. "I hate this part," she told Caleb one night, her voice thick with exhaustion and grief. They sat at the small table, the remains of a simple dinner between them, knowing that sometimes, no matter what you do, it's not enough, that life is fragile and unfair, and... She broke off, pressing her hands to her face. Without thinking, Caleb stood and moved to her side. He pulled her gently to her feet and into his arms, holding her while she shook with silent tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I don't usually..." "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "You don't have to be strong all the time." She clung to him, her fingers gripping his shirt, and Caleb held her tighter, ignoring the dull ache in his ribs. This was more important than pain. This was Marin, finally letting herself be vulnerable, finally accepting comfort instead of always giving it. When her tears subsided, she didn't pull away immediately. She stayed in the circle of his arms, her cheek pressed to his shoulder, breathing in slow, shuddering gulps. "Thank you," she finally said. "Always." She did pull back then, wiping at her eyes with the heel of her hand. "I must look a mess." "You look beautiful." The words hung between them, honest and unadorned. Marin's eyes widened, color flooding her cheeks. "Caleb?" A sharp knock on the door cut her off. They both froze. It was well past dark. No one should be calling at this hour. Another knock, more insistent. Miss Hale? You in there? It's Sheriff Mason. Marin glanced at Caleb, who was already moving toward the bedroom to hide. But before he could disappear, the door burst open. Sheriff Mason stumbled inside, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Behind him, the night was full of the sound of galloping horses and shouting men. "They're coming!" the sheriff gasped. "Pritchard's men. Someone told them you've got Caleb here. You need to run. Now!" Caleb's blood turned to ice. "How many?" "6, maybe more. Heavily armed." The sheriff swayed, caught himself against the doorframe. "I tried to turn them back, but Jessup hit me with his rifle butt, and—" "Where are they now?" Marin demanded, already grabbing supplies, her medical bag, anything essential. 2 minutes behind me, maybe less." The sheriff looked at Caleb, and there was genuine regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, son. I sent that telegram like I said I would, but I guess someone in the marshal's office is on Pritchard's payroll. They knew before I even got a response back." "It's not your fault," Caleb said, though his mind was racing. 6 men. He had his revolver with 3 bullets. Marin had nothing, and his ribs, though much better, were still far from healed. He couldn't run far or fast. "You two need to go. I'll hold them off." "Don't be stupid," Marin snapped. "We all go or no one does." "She's right," the sheriff said, though he was clearly struggling to stay upright. "There's an old mining camp about 3 miles north, abandoned, half collapsed, but it's got places to hide. If you can make it there." The thunder of hoofbeats was suddenly very close. Too close. "Out the back," Caleb ordered. "Through the shed. Go!" Marin hesitated for a fraction of a second, then grabbed the sheriff's arm and hauled him toward the back door. Caleb followed, his ribs screaming protest as he moved faster than he had in days. They burst out of the shed just as gunfire erupted from the front of the cabin. Windows shattered, wood splintered. "This way!" The sheriff pointed north toward a dense line of cottonwoods that marked the creek bank. They ran. The darkness swallowed them whole as they crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at their clothes and skin. Behind them, angry voices shouted orders and more gunfire split the night. Caleb's lungs burned with each gasping breath, his ribs sending white-hot spikes of agony through his chest with every jarring step. But he didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. Sheriff Mason stumbled and went down hard, a strangled cry escaping his lips. Marin was there instantly, hauling him back to his feet with strength that seemed impossible for someone her size. "Keep moving," she hissed. "We're not dying tonight." They plunged into the cottonwoods, the canopy overhead blocking out even the faint starlight. Caleb could hear the creek somewhere ahead, rushing water over stones. His boot caught on a root and he nearly went sprawling, but caught himself at the last second against a tree trunk. "They're in the trees!" Jessup's voice rang out, much too close. "Spread out! Don't let them reach the creek!" Marin grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him sharply to the left. The sheriff followed, one hand pressed to his bleeding head, the other gripping a pistol he'd somehow managed to hold on to. They half ran, half slid down the embankment toward the water. The creek was swollen from recent rains, running fast and dark. Caleb didn't hesitate. He waded in, gasping as the cold water hit his legs, then his waist. Marin followed, holding her medical bag above her head. The sheriff came last, moving slower, his breathing labored. "Cross to the other side," Mason wheezed. "Follow the bank north. The old mine's about a mile from here." Behind them, firelight flickered through the trees. The men had brought torches. They pushed through the current, fighting to keep their footing on the slippery stones. The water came up to Caleb's chest, and he felt the strength draining from his arms. His ribs were screaming now, every breath a battle. Beside him, Marin was struggling too, her teeth chattering from the cold. They made it to the far bank and hauled themselves out, water streaming from their clothes. No time to rest. The torchlight was getting closer, and now Caleb could hear dogs barking. They'd brought dogs. "Move!" he gasped, and they stumbled forward into another stand of trees. The terrain rose steadily, growing rockier. Caleb's boots slipped on loose shale. He went down on one knee, caught himself, forced his body upright again. Marin was right beside him, her hand on his elbow, steadying him. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely. "Just keep going." They crested a ridge, and the sheriff pointed ahead to where the land dropped away into darkness. "There. See that rock fall?"
The mine entrance is just beyond it. Caleb squinted through the gloom and made out a tumble of boulders and what looked like collapsed timbers. It didn't look like much of a refuge, but it was better than being caught in the open.
They scrambled down the slope, sending small avalanches of loose rock clattering ahead of them. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness, announcing their position to anyone listening. Caleb's heart hammered against his bruised ribs as they reached the rockfall and began picking their way through. The mine entrance was a black mouth in the hillside, half buried by debris and overgrown with weeds. The timbers that had once framed it were rotted and sagging, looking like they might collapse at any moment. "Inside," the sheriff urged. "Quickly!" They ducked through the narrow opening into absolute darkness. The air was dank and cold, smelling of earth and decay. Caleb felt along the rough stone wall, moving deeper into the tunnel. His hand touched something that crumbled at his touch, and he recoiled, hoping it wasn't what he thought it was. Behind them, the sheriff was doing something with his coat in the entrance. Caleb heard fabric ripping, then the scrape of rocks being moved. "What are you doing?" Marin whispered. "Covering our tracks." Making it look like the entrance collapsed further. Mason's voice was strained with pain and effort. "Won't fool them forever, but might buy us some time." They moved deeper into the mine, away from the entrance and any betraying moonlight. Caleb's hands scraped against the walls as he felt his way forward. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, sloping gradually downward. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness with a steady, maddening rhythm. Finally, when Caleb judged they were far enough from the entrance that a light wouldn't be visible, he stopped. "We need to rest. Just for a minute." They sank to the cold stone floor, their breathing harsh and ragged in the enclosed space. Caleb could feel Marin shaking beside him, whether from cold or fear or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Probably all three. "Anyone hurt besides the sheriff?" she asked, her voice tight with professional concern even now. "I'm fine," Caleb lied. "You're not fine. I can hear you breathing. You've torn something." Her hands found his in the darkness, squeezing hard. "But we'll deal with that later. Sheriff, how bad is your head?" "I'll live," Mason said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Got a skull like a rock," my wife always said. They sat in silence for a moment, listening for sounds of pursuit. Caleb could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears, the drip of water, Marin's shallow breathing beside him. Then, faint but unmistakable, voices from outside the mine. "Check that rockfall! They could have gone through there!" Everyone froze. Caleb's hand moved to his revolver, though he knew 3 bullets wouldn't be enough if Jessup's men found them. The voices grew louder, closer. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Someone was right outside the entrance. "Looks like it collapsed recently," a voice said. Bigelow, Caleb recognized. "Could be natural, or could be they tried to hide in there and got buried. Or could be they're hiding inside right now." That was Jessup, cold and certain. "Dutch, take a look." Caleb heard the scrape of boots on stone, someone climbing over the rockfall. His fingers tightened on the revolver. Beside him, Marin had gone absolutely still. A light appeared at the tunnel entrance, growing brighter. Someone was coming in with a torch. The sheriff leaned close to Caleb's ear. "There's a side passage about 20 feet ahead on the left. Used to lead to a played-out vein. Take Marin and go. I'll hold them here." "No," Marin whispered urgently. "We're not leaving you. You don't have a choice. I'm half dead already, and I'll be damned if Pritchard wins because I slowed you down." Mason pressed his pistol into Caleb's hand. 7 shots. Make them count. Now go, before that torch gets close enough to see us. The torchlight was advancing down the tunnel, throwing wild shadows on the walls. They were out of time. Caleb grabbed Marin's hand and pulled her deeper into the mine. She resisted for a second, then followed, her hand gripping his so hard it hurt. They felt their way along the wall, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. Behind them, the torchlight stopped. "I see something," Dutch's voice called out. "Looks like, there's someone here." "Sheriff Mason," Jessup's voice answered, echoing down the tunnel. "Come out nice and peaceful-like. No need for this to get messy." Caleb found the side passage by touch, a narrow opening in the left wall. He pulled Marin into it just as gunfire erupted behind them, deafeningly loud in the confined space. The muzzle flashes lit up the main tunnel in strobing bursts of light. They ran, bent low, hands scraping against rough walls. The side passage twisted and turned, growing narrower. Caleb had to turn sideways to fit through some sections, his shoulders brushing both walls. Behind them, more gunshots, then shouting, then an ominous silence. "The sheriff!" Marin gasped. "We have to go back, 'cause he bought us time," Caleb said, his throat tight with grief and anger. "We can't waste it." The passage opened suddenly into a larger chamber. Caleb nearly fell as the walls disappeared and his hands found only empty air. They stopped, breathing hard, trying to get their bearings in the absolute darkness. "Where are we?" Marin whispered. Before Caleb could answer, light bloomed behind them. Torches. Multiple torches coming through the side passage they'd just navigated. "Got their tracks in the dust," someone shouted. "They went this way." Caleb pulled Marin to the left, away from the passage entrance. His boots hit something that clattered and rolled, old mining equipment scattered across the chamber floor. They picked their way through the debris, trying not to make noise, knowing it was futile. The torchlight spilled into the chamber, revealing a space about 30 feet across with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. Old support beams crisscrossed overhead, many of them cracked or sagging. In the center of the floor was a shaft, its opening covered by a rusted metal grate. And standing at the far side of the chamber, backed against the wall, were Caleb and Marin. Ray Jessup stepped into the chamber, his torch held high. Dutch Carver and Tom Bigelow followed, along with 3 other men Caleb didn't recognize, all of them armed, all of them between Caleb and the only exit. "Well now," Jessup said, his dead eyes reflecting the torchlight. "End of the line, Arden." Caleb raised the sheriff's pistol, knowing it was hopeless. "Stay back." "Or what? You'll shoot?" "Go ahead. You might get one of us, maybe 2 if you're lucky. But the rest will cut you down." Jessup's smile was a cold, terrible thing. "Mr. Pritchard sends his regards. Says he's sorry it had to come to this, but you really should have kept your mouth shut." "Pritchard murdered a family in cold blood," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "And you're helping him cover it up. That make you proud?" "It makes me employed," Jessup said. "Something you ain't going to be for much longer. Now, you can make this easy or hard. Your choice. But either way, you're dying tonight." Marin stepped forward, putting herself partially in front of Caleb. "You'll have to go through me first." Jessup's expression didn't change. "That can be arranged, ma'am, though Mr. Pritchard did say to make it quick for you. Professional courtesy, seeing as you're a healer. But if you'd rather make this difficult, touch her and I'll kill every last one of you," Caleb snarled, the pistol steady in his hand. Big words from a man with a cracked rib and 6 guns pointed at him. Jessup gestured to his men. "Take them." Everything happened at once. Caleb fired, the shot catching one of the unknown men in the shoulder and spinning him around. Marin dove to the side, grabbing a length of rusted pipe from the debris. The other men opened fire, muzzle flashes lighting up the chamber like lightning. Caleb felt something burn across his upper arm as he fired again, missed, fired a 3rd time and saw Dutch Carver go down clutching his leg. He and Marin were moving, scrambling behind an old ore cart for cover as bullets sparked off metal and stone. "The shaft!" Marin shouted, pointing. "If we can reach it!" She didn't finish because Bigelow rushed their position, firing wildly. Caleb shot him in the chest, watched him fall, then the pistol clicked empty. Out of ammunition. Jessup was reloading, his movements quick and practiced. The 2 remaining men were flanking, trying to get a clear shot around the ore cart. Caleb made a decision. He grabbed Marin's hand and ran for the shaft. Bullets chewed up the ground around their feet. They reached the rusted grate and Caleb kicked it, once, twice. On the 3rd kick it gave way with a screech of tortured metal, falling into darkness. He didn't hear it hit bottom. "Trust me," he said to Marin. Her eyes were wide with terror and understanding. "Are you insane?" "Probably." He kissed her, hard and quick, tasting salt and fear and something sweet beneath it. "Jump on 3. 1. Caleb. 2. Jessup was running toward them, gun raised. 3. They jumped. The fall seemed to last forever and no time at all. Darkness rushing past, air screaming in their ears, Marin's scream cut short as they hit water. The impact drove the air from Caleb's lungs and sent shockwaves of agony through his ribs. Cold enveloped him, pressed in from all sides. Then the current caught them. The underground stream moved fast, pulling them along like leaves in a flood. Caleb fought to keep his head above water, to keep hold of Marin's hand. His ribs felt like they were tearing apart. His vision swam with pain and lack of oxygen. The stream carried them through absolute darkness, bouncing them off rocks, dragging them under and spitting them back up. Caleb's shoulder slammed into stone, and he felt something give way with a wet pop. His grip on Marin's hand slipped. "Marin!" he shouted, swallowing water, choking. Her hand found his again, iron tight. "I'm here!" The current grew faster, the water rougher. Caleb could hear the roar of what sounded like rapids ahead. He tried to angle toward what he hoped was the bank, but the current was too strong. They shot around a bend, and suddenly there was light, faint starlight filtering down through a crack in the ceiling. In that brief illumination, Caleb saw white water ahead, rocks jutting up like teeth. "Hold your breath," he managed to gasp before the rapids took them. The world became chaos. Water and stone and pain, spinning end over end, lungs burning, ribs screaming. Something hit Caleb's head and stars exploded behind his eyes. He lost Marin's hand again, reached blindly, found nothing. Then the stream spat him out into calmer water and he surfaced, gasping and coughing. His head was ringing, blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye. His left arm hung useless at his side, dislocated shoulder grinding against the socket. "Marin!" He spun in the water, searching. "Marin! Here!" Her voice came from behind him, weak but alive. He turned and saw her clinging to a rock near the bank, her face pale in the starlight. Relief flooded through him so intensely it was almost painful. They made it to the shore and collapsed onto mud and gravel, coughing up water, shaking with cold and shock and adrenaline. For a long moment, they just lay there, breathing, alive against all odds. Finally, Caleb managed to sit up. His dislocated shoulder sent waves of nausea through him, but he pushed through it. "Are you hurt?" "Cuts and bruises, nothing serious." Marin crawled over to him, her hands already assessing his injuries with practiced efficiency despite her own trembling. "Your shoulder's dislocated. I need to set it." "I know." He braced himself. "Do it quick." She positioned herself behind him, her hands finding the right places on his arm and shoulder. "On 3. 1, 2. She popped it back into place on 2, and Caleb's vision went white. He might have screamed. When the world came back into focus, Marin was holding him, murmuring something soothing he couldn't quite make out. "You're okay," she was saying. "You're okay. We're both okay." Caleb became aware that he was shaking, his whole body racked with tremors. Shock setting in. Marin pulled him closer, sharing what little warmth she had. "The sheriff," she whispered against his hair. "Do you think—" "I don't know." Caleb's throat was tight. Mason had been shot, that much was certain. Whether he'd survived or bought them time with his life, there was no way to know. Not now. They sat together on the muddy bank as dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink. The stream burbled past them, peaceful now, as if it hadn't nearly killed them both. Somewhere above, birds were starting to sing. Caleb had no idea where they were. No idea if Jessup and his men were still searching for them, or if they'd given them up for dead. No idea what came next. All he knew was that Marin was alive and warm in his arms, that they had survived another night, and that the sun was rising on a day he hadn't been sure he'd live to see. "We need to move," Marin said eventually, though she made no effort to pull away. "Find shelter. Get warm before hypothermia sets in." "In a minute," Caleb said, holding her tighter. "Just let me hold you for one more minute." She nodded against his shoulder, and they stayed that way, two battered survivors watching the sun climb above the horizon, painting the world in gold and amber and the fragile promise of a new day. When they finally stood, helping each other up on unsteady legs, Caleb looked around and got his bearings. They were in a narrow canyon, the stream cutting through layered rock. To the north, the canyon widened into what looked like grassland. To the south, it climbed back toward the hills and the mine they'd escaped from. "North," he said. "Put as much distance between us and Pritchard's men as we can." They walked, leaning on each other, leaving wet footprints on the rocky shore. Caleb's ribs throbbed with every step, and his shoulder felt like someone had stuck a hot poker through the joint. Marin limped, favoring her left leg, though she insisted it was just bruised. The sun climbed higher as they walked, warming them slowly. Their clothes began to dry in stiff, uncomfortable patches. Caleb's head pounded from the blow he'd taken in the rapids, and he kept having to stop to catch his breath. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, the canyon opened into a wide valley. In the distance, Caleb could see a building, a farmhouse, smoke rising from its chimney. "There," he said, pointing. "Maybe they'll help us." They stumbled across the grassland toward the farmhouse, and Caleb was dimly aware that they must look like something out of a nightmare. Bruised, bleeding, soaking wet, half dead on their feet. A dog started barking as they approached. The farmhouse door opened and a woman stepped out, followed by a man carrying a rifle. "Help!" Marin called out, her voice cracking. "Please, we need help!" The woman took one look at them and rushed forward, calling back to the man. "Henry, get the wagon! These folks need a doctor!" "I am a doctor," Marin said, then laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "Or close enough. But yes, we need help." The woman, middle-aged, with kind eyes and capable hands, caught Marin before she fell. The man, Henry, slung Caleb's good arm over his shoulders and helped him toward the house. "What happened to you?" the woman asked as they got them inside into the warm kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee. "Accident at the mine," Caleb said, the lie coming automatically. Until he knew these people, until he knew if they were under Pritchard's influence, he couldn't risk the truth. "Cave in. We barely got out." The man and woman exchanged glances but didn't press. They set about making Caleb and Marin comfortable, bringing blankets and hot coffee and asking no more questions. Caleb caught Marin's eye across the room. She gave him a small nod. They were safe. For now. Later, after the couple had left them alone to rest in a small guest room, Marin redressed Caleb's wounds with supplies from her miraculously intact medical bag. Her hands were steady despite everything they'd been through. "That was close," she said quietly. "Too close." "Yeah." Caleb winced as she tightened the bandage around his ribs. "Marin, what you did back there, stepping between me and Jessup's gun, don't!" She cut him off, her hand stilling on the bandage. "Don't tell me it was stupid or reckless. I know what it was. I was going to say it was the bravest thing I've ever seen." She looked up at him, her creekwater eyes shining with unshed tears. "I couldn't let them hurt you. I couldn't just stand there and—" Her voice broke. Caleb reached for her with his good arm, pulled her close. I know. And when you went under in that water and I couldn't find your hand, I thought—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "But we made it," she whispered. "We're alive." "We're alive," he echoed. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her expression fierce and tender all at once. "Caleb Arden, if we survive this, when we survive this, I am never letting you out of my sight again. Is that a promise?" "It's a guarantee." And then she was kissing him, her lips soft and desperate against his. Caleb kissed her back, pouring everything he couldn't say into that kiss, his fear and hope, and the overwhelming certainty that this woman had become his whole world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marin rested her forehead against his. "One day at a time," she said, echoing the words from weeks ago that felt like a lifetime. "One day at a time," Caleb agreed, starting with today. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the Montana sky, indifferent to the small dramas of human survival playing out below. But inside that farmhouse, in that quiet moment of peace, stolen from chaos, two people held each other and dared to believe that tomorrow might actually come, and that when it did, they would face it together. They stayed at the farmhouse for 3 days while Caleb's body fought to heal from injuries stacked upon injuries. The couple who'd taken them in, Henry and Martha Brennan, asked no questions beyond what they needed to know for practical care. Martha kept them fed with hearty stews and fresh bread. Henry brought clean clothes that had belonged to their son before he'd moved east to Chicago, and both of them had the good sense to understand that sometimes strangers needed sanctuary without explanation. On the second day, while Caleb slept fitfully in the guest room, Marin helped Martha with the washing. They worked in companionable silence for a while, hands busy with soap and water, before Martha finally spoke. "My husband thinks you're running from something," she said quietly, not looking up from the shirt she was scrubbing. "Or someone." Marin's hand stilled on the fabric she was wringing out.
"And what do you think?" "I think that gash on your man's ribs didn't come from any mine accident. I've seen enough bullet wounds to know one when I see it." Martha finally looked up, her eyes kind but shrewd. "I also think that whoever you're running from is probably worse than whatever consequences might come from helping you. So we're not asking and we're not telling. But you should know that Samuel Pritchard's men came through here yesterday while you were both sleeping." Marin's blood went cold. "What did they want?" "Said they were looking for a wounded cowboy and a woman. Said the man was dangerous, had killed someone in Cold Creek." Martha's expression hardened. "I told them I hadn't seen anyone matching that description. Henry told them the same. They didn't believe us, but they didn't push it either. Searched the barn and the outbuildings, then rode on." "Thank you," Marin whispered. "You're taking a terrible risk." "Maybe, but I don't trust Pritchard or anyone who works for him. That man has too much power and too little conscience." Martha went back to her scrubbing. "Besides, I saw how your man looks at you, and how you look at him. That's not the look of criminals. That's the look of people worth saving." Marin felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. "We'll leave as soon as Caleb can travel. I promise we won't bring more trouble to your door." "You'll leave when you're ready and not a moment before," Martha said firmly. "Though I will say this, you can't run forever. Eventually, you're going to have to turn and fight." Those words haunted Marin as she returned to check on Caleb. She found him awake, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man wrestling with impossible decisions. "Jessup's men were here," she said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I heard." Caleb's voice was rough with exhaustion. "Martha told Henry, and Henry made sure I knew before I did something stupid like try to run. We can't stay here much longer. Every day we remain puts the Brennans at risk." "I know." Caleb struggled to sit up, wincing at the pull on his ribs. "But we can't keep running either. Martha's right about that. Pritchard has too much reach, too many resources. He'll just keep sending men until we're dead or he gets bored, and men like Pritchard don't get bored." Marin reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "So what do we do?" "We do what we should have done from the start. We go on the offensive." Caleb's eyes met hers, and Marin saw a determination there that hadn't been present before. Something had hardened in him over the past few days, a core of steel forged in desperation and survival. "I need to get to the territorial capital, file an official statement with the marshal's office. Get it on record before Pritchard can bury it." The sheriff tried that. Look what happened. The sheriff sent a quiet telegram that someone intercepted. I'm talking about walking into the marshal's office in person, bringing you as a witness to the attempt on my life, and making enough noise that Pritchard can't make it disappear. He squeezed her hand. "It's risky. But staying in motion, staying visible, that's our best chance. We make ourselves too public to kill quietly." Marin absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. It was bold, possibly reckless, but it was also the first plan that felt like more than just delaying the inevitable. "Helena is 4 days' ride from here," she said slowly. "You're in no shape for that kind of travel. Then we take it slow. Rest when we need to, but we start moving tomorrow." He pulled her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "I'm tired of being afraid, Marin. Tired of looking over my shoulder. I want a life where I can wake up next to you without wondering if it's the last morning we'll have." The word sent a rush of warmth through her chest, followed immediately by a spike of fear, because wanting something that much meant having something to lose. "When this is over," she said carefully, "when Pritchard is in prison and we're safe, what then?" Caleb's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, his touch gentle and grounding. "Then I buy that piece of land I've been dreaming about, build a house, raise horses." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "And if you're willing, I'd like you there with me, not as someone passing through, but as someone who stays." Marin's breath caught. It was the closest he'd come to saying the words that hung unspoken between them, the feelings that had grown from desperate circumstances into something real and lasting. "I'd like that," she whispered. I'd like that very much. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, the future stretching out before them like the Montana prairie, vast and uncertain and full of possibility. The next morning, Henry hitched up a wagon and loaded it with supplies. Martha packed enough food for a week's journey and pressed a small leather pouch into Marin's hands. "Money," she said when Marin tried to refuse. "Not a fortune, but enough for lodging and meals. Consider it an investment in seeing justice done." "We'll pay you back," Caleb promised from the wagon seat where he'd managed to climb with only minimal help. "You'll do no such thing," Henry said gruffly. "Just make sure that bastard Pritchard gets what's coming to him. That'll be payment enough." They pulled away from the farmhouse as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Marin drove while Caleb rested beside her, his color better than it had been, but still too pale for her liking. The first day's travel was uneventful. They followed game trails and old prospector roads, staying away from main routes where Pritchard's men might be watching. The Montana landscape rolled past in endless variations of grassland and distant mountains, big sky overhead that made Marin feel simultaneously small and infinite. They made camp that night beside a spring-fed creek, building a small fire and eating Martha's food while the stars wheeled overhead. Caleb moved stiffly, but without the agonized care that had characterized his earlier movements. His ribs were healing, finally, though Marin knew they still pained him. "Tell me about your family," Caleb said as they lay side by side, watching the Milky Way spill across the darkness. "Your parents, what were they like?" Marin was quiet for a moment, gathering memories that had grown soft with time. "My father was a school teacher, loved books more than anything except my mother. She was practical where he was dreamy, kept him grounded." A smile touched her lips. "They used to argue about everything, politics, philosophy, what to have for dinner. But underneath the arguments, there was this foundation of love so solid you could build a house on it." "They sound wonderful." They were. The smile faded. When the cholera came, it took them both within a week. Thomas and I buried them in the town cemetery, and I remember thinking that at least they went together, that neither of them had to live without the other. She turned her head to look at Caleb. "I used to think that kind of love was rare, something most people spent their whole lives searching for and never found. And now? Now I think I was wrong. I think it finds you when you're not looking, when you're too busy trying to survive to notice it creeping up on you." She reached over and found his hand in the darkness. "Like this." Caleb's fingers tightened around hers. "I love you, Marin Hale. I know it's fast, I know it's probably crazy, but I love you, and I needed you to know that." The words hung in the night air, simple and honest and terrifying in their finality. Marin's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned to face him fully. "I love you too," she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. "I think I started falling for you the moment you looked up at me from behind that boulder, bleeding and brave and refusing to give up. And every day since then, I've fallen a little more." Caleb pulled her close, careful of his injuries, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her throat tight. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to make it through this," he promised. "Both of us. Together." "Together," she echoed, and let herself believe it. The second day brought rain, a cold drizzle that soaked through their clothes and turned the roads to mud. They pressed on anyway, Marin driving through the downpour while Caleb dozed fitfully beside her. His fever had returned just slightly, and she worried that the infection in his ribs had flared up again despite her careful tending. They found shelter that night in an abandoned homesteader's cabin, its roof mostly intact and its walls solid enough to keep out the worst of the weather. Marin built a fire in the old stone fireplace and made Caleb strip off his wet clothes so she could examine his wounds. The bullet graze had reopened slightly, weeping clear fluid but not pus. His ribs were still mottled with bruises, but the swelling had gone down. His shoulder was the worst of it, black and purple from the dislocation, but the joint moved properly when she tested it. "You're healing," she pronounced, relief flooding through her. "The fever's just your body working overtime, nothing to worry about." "Good." Caleb's eyes were heavy-lidded, exhaustion pulling at him. "Because I don't think I could handle another near-death experience this week."
Marin laughed despite herself and helped him into dry clothes. They ate cold food from Martha's pack and huddled close to the fire as the rain drummed on the roof. "Do you ever think about what we'll tell people?" Caleb asked drowsily, his head resting on Marin's shoulder. "About how we met. We'll tell them the truth, that you were in trouble and I helped you, and somewhere along the way we fell in love. They'll say it's a dime novel romance, too dramatic to be real. Let them say what they want." Marin pressed a kiss to his temple. "We'll know the truth." The third day dawned clear and cold. They made good time, covering nearly 20 miles before stopping for the night. The landscape was changing as they traveled northeast, the grasslands giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose like a wall against the western sky. They were following a narrow trail through a stand of trees when Caleb suddenly grabbed Marin's arm.
"Stop!" he whispered urgently. She pulled the wagon to a halt, her heart immediately racing. "What is it?" "Riders. 4 of them, maybe half a mile ahead where the trail opens up." He'd been scanning the horizon constantly, old habits from his years as a cowboy reasserting themselves. "Could be nothing, could be—" "Pritchard's men." Marin's stomach dropped. "What do we do?" Caleb was already climbing down from the wagon, moving with careful speed. "There's a deer trail off to the left. Narrow, but the wagon should fit. We take it, circle around, stay in the trees." They guided the wagon onto the barely visible trail, branches scraping against the canvas cover. The horses balked at first, unused to such rough going, but Marin coaxed them forward with quiet words and gentle hands. Behind them, they heard voices. The riders had reached the spot where they'd left the main trail. "Fresh tracks," someone called out. "Wagon, 2 horses. Went this way." "It could be anyone," another voice answered. Jessup. Marin would recognize that cold, dead tone anywhere.
"Or it could be them. Come on." The sound of hoofbeats grew closer. Marin urged the horses faster, but the trail was too rough for speed. A wheel hit a rock and the wagon lurched sickeningly. Caleb grabbed the side to keep from being thrown off. "There!" someone shouted. "In the trees!" Gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into tree trunks and kicking up dirt. Marin snapped the reins and the horses bolted forward, crashing through underbrush. The wagon bounced and swayed, threatening to overturn. Caleb had drawn his revolver. Henry had given him a fully loaded one before they left, and was firing back at their pursuers. The narrow trail worked in their favor, forcing the riders to stay in single file, limiting their ability to surround the wagon. They burst out of the trees into a clearing, and Marin saw their chance. A rocky ravine cut across the landscape ahead, its sides steep but not quite vertical. A gamble, but staying on open ground meant certain death. "Hold on!" she shouted, and drove the wagon straight at the ravine. They hit the edge and plunged downward. The horses screamed, fighting the harness. The wagon tipped onto 2 wheels, balanced impossibly for a heartbeat, then crashed back down with bone-jarring force. Marin felt something crack beneath them. An axle? A wheel? But the wagon kept moving, sliding and skidding down the rocky slope. They hit the bottom, and the momentum carried them forward into another stand of trees on the far side. Marin didn't let up, driving the horses deeper into the forest until the terrain forced them to slow. Finally, when she judged they'd put enough distance between themselves and the ravine, she pulled the wagon to a stop. They sat in silence, breathing hard, listening for sounds of pursuit. Nothing. Just wind in the trees and the nervous stamping of the horses. "Did we lose them?" Marin whispered. Caleb climbed stiffly down to check the wagon. Back left wheels cracked. "Won't hold for long, maybe another day if we're lucky and take it easy." He looked back the way they'd come. "As for losing them, maybe. That ravine will slow them down, but they'll find a way across eventually." "How far are we from Helena?" "Day and a half at normal speed. With a damaged wheel?" He grimaced. 2 days, maybe more." They couldn't afford 2 more days, not with Jessup and his men on their trail. Marin made a decision. "We abandon the wagon, take the horses, and ride hard for Helena. We can make it in a day if we push." "You think the horses can handle both of us in hard riding?" "I think we don't have a choice." She climbed down and started unhitching the team. "We take what supplies we can carry and leave the rest. Move fast, stay off main trails, and pray we reach the marshal's office before Pritchard's men catch up."
They worked quickly, transferring essential supplies to saddlebags and makeshift packs. Food, water, Marin's medical supplies, the money from Martha, and what little ammunition they had left. Everything else they left behind. Within 20 minutes, they were mounted and moving, Caleb on one horse and Marin on the other. The animals were draft horses, bred for pulling, not speed, but they were strong and steady, and that would have to be enough. They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, following game trails and creek beds, always heading northeast toward the territorial capital. Caleb's face grew increasingly tight with pain as the day wore on, but he never complained, never suggested they slow down. As darkness fell, they finally allowed themselves a brief rest beside a small stream. The horses drank gratefully while Caleb and Marin shared the last of Martha's bread and some dried meat. "We're close," Caleb said, studying the stars. "Helena can't be more than 30 miles from here. If we ride through the night—" "You need rest," Marin interrupted. "Your body's been through hell, Caleb. Another few hours won't make a difference." "It might. If Jessup's still tracking us, then a few hours of rest will make us sharper, more able to react if we run into trouble." She touched his face gently, feeling the heat of fever beneath his skin. "Please, just until dawn. Then we'll ride hard for Helena and not stop until we're standing in front of the territorial marshal himself." Caleb wanted to argue. She could see it in his eyes, but exhaustion won out. "Until dawn," he agreed. They made a cold camp, not risking a fire that might give away their position. Marin checked Caleb's bandages by moonlight and dosed him with willow bark tea for the fever. Then they lay together under a single blanket, sharing warmth, listening to the night sounds of the Montana wilderness. "Marin," Caleb said softly, just as she was drifting off to sleep, "if something happens tomorrow—" "Nothing's going to happen." "But if it does, if Pritchard's men find us before we reach Helena, I need you to promise me something." She raised her head to look at him. "What?" "Promise me you'll run, that you won't try to be brave or stand your ground. Just run, get to safety, and tell someone, anyone, what Pritchard did." "I'm not leaving you." "Marin, I said I'm not leaving you, Caleb Arden. We survive together or not at all." Her voice was fierce, brooking no argument. "That's my promise. Take it or leave it." He stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her down into a kiss that tasted of desperation and love and defiance. When they broke apart, his eyes were bright in the moonlight. "Together, then," he whispered. "Together," she agreed. They woke before dawn to the sound of horses. Not their own. Those were still tethered nearby, ears pricked forward in alarm. Other horses moving through the trees to the south. Caleb and Marin were on their feet in seconds, gathering their supplies with practiced speed. No time to saddle the horses properly. They swung up bareback, Marin clutching a handful of mane to keep her seat. The other horses were getting closer. How many? Impossible to tell in the pre-dawn darkness. "Go," Caleb said, and they went. They crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about noise, only about speed. Behind them, shouts rang out. Someone had seen them. The chase was on. They burst out of the trees onto a well-traveled road just as the sun crested the horizon. Caleb pointed northeast toward where a smudge of buildings was visible in the distance. "Helena!" he shouted over the thunder of hoofbeats. "We're almost there!" The road made for easier riding, and their horses opened up into a gallop. But behind them, Pritchard's men were gaining, their horses fresher and bred for speed. A shot rang out, then another. Marin felt the wind of a bullet pass her ear and ducked low over her horse's neck. The buildings grew closer. Marin could make out individual structures now, a church, a large building that might be a hotel, streets laid out in a grid. People were starting to emerge, drawn by the sound of gunfire. "The courthouse!" Caleb shouted, pointing at a 3-story stone building at the center of town. "That's where the marshal's office is." They galloped down the main street, scattering pedestrians and drawing startled shouts. Behind them, Jessup and his men followed, still firing. The courthouse steps loomed ahead. Caleb and Marin threw themselves off their horses and ran, taking the steps 2 at a time. Bullets chipped stone around them. They burst through the courthouse doors into a marble-floored hallway filled with stunned officials and clerks. A man in a dark suit and tin star stepped forward, hand on his gun.
What in the hell is going on here? He demanded. Are you the territorial marshal? Caleb gasped, bleeding from a fresh wound on his arm that Marin hadn't even seen him take. Deputy Marshal Frank Hollis, and you better have a damn good reason for— Samuel Pritchard murdered a Cheyenne family in cold blood 3 weeks ago, Caleb said, his voice carrying through the hall. I witnessed it, and those men outside have been trying to kill me ever since to keep me quiet. Hollis's expression shifted from anger to sharp attention. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Marin stepped forward, pulling back her sleeve to show the bruises and cuts covering her arm. I'm a healer. I found this man wounded and helped him. Pritchard's men have tried to kill us both multiple times. The sheriff of Cold Creek tried to help us and was shot for it, maybe killed. We have nothing to gain from lying and everything to lose. The courthouse doors burst open again, and Jessup strode in, gun drawn, his men behind him. He stopped short when he saw the deputy marshal. Stand down, Hollis ordered, his hand still on his own weapon. Nobody draws in my courthouse. This man's a murderer, Jessup said, pointing at Caleb. Killed 3 men in Cold Creek and kidnapped a woman. We've been trying to bring him to justice. That's a lie, Marin said coldly. This man is Raymond Jessup, foreman for the Triple J Ranch. He works for Samuel Pritchard, and he's been hunting us on Pritchard's orders. Everyone shut up, Hollis commanded. He looked from Caleb to Jessup and back again, clearly trying to assess the situation. You, he said to Caleb, you're willing to make an official statement, under oath, knowing that filing a false report is a crime? Yes. And you? He turned to Marin. You'll corroborate his story? Every word of it. Hollis nodded slowly, decision made. Then you two come with me. We'll take your statements and telegraph the federal authorities. He pointed at Jessup. And you wait right here. Don't even think about leaving town until I sort this mess out. Jessup's face went dark with fury, but he holstered his gun. Mr. Pritchard will hear about this. I expect he will, Hollis said mildly. That's kind of the point. He led Caleb and Marin deeper into the courthouse, into a small office where they spent the next hour giving detailed statements. Hollis asked sharp questions, probing for inconsistencies, clearly a man who took his job seriously. When they were done, he sat back and studied them. If even half of what you're telling me is true, Samuel Pritchard is going to hang. It's all true, Caleb said. Every word. Then we've got work to do. Hollis stood, gathering the papers. I'm sending telegrams to the federal marshal and the territorial governor. This is bigger than me, bigger than Cold Creek. This is about whether men with money and power are subject to the same laws as everyone else. He paused at the door. You two stay in Helena. Don't leave town. Don't do anything that might compromise this investigation. Understood? They nodded, too exhausted to do anything else. Hollis left, and for the first time in weeks, Caleb and Marin were truly alone and truly safe. They looked at each other across the small office, and then Marin was in his arms, and they were holding each other so tightly it hurt. We did it, she whispered against his chest. We actually did it. We did, Caleb agreed, hardly daring to believe it. It's not over. The trial, the testimony, all of that is still ahead. But we got our foot in the door. We made enough noise that Pritchard can't make us disappear. They stood like that for a long time, 2 people who had survived the impossible, clinging to each other and the fragile hope of justice finally within reach. Outside the office windows, Helena bustled with its daily business, unaware that in this small room, the foundation was being laid for a reckoning that would shake the entire territory. The weeks that followed moved with a strange mixture of agonizing slowness and breathless speed. Deputy Marshal Hollis secured them rooms at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who asked no questions and kept watchful eyes on anyone who came near her guests. Caleb's wounds continued their stubborn march toward healing, and Marin found work tending to the sick in Helena's small hospital, her skills in constant demand. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, tension simmered. Pritchard's lawyers descended on Helena like vultures, filing motions and injunctions, trying to bury the case in legal procedure before it ever reached a courtroom. The territorial governor, a man named Wallace with ambitions for higher office, took personal interest in the case, seeing it as an opportunity to prove that Montana Territory was a place of law and order, not frontier chaos.
News of the accusation spread like wildfire through the territory. Newspapers picked up the story, some sympathetic, others clearly in Pritchard's pocket. The Montana Sentinel ran a scathing editorial calling Caleb a liar and Marin a deluded woman led astray by romantic notions. The Helena Independent countered with an investigation into Pritchard's land acquisitions, revealing a pattern of suspicious deaths and disappearances among those who'd stood in his way. Through it all, Caleb and Marin waited, their lives suspended in the strange limbo between danger and safety. One evening, 3 weeks after their arrival in Helena, they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. Marin's hand rested in Caleb's, their fingers intertwined in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Deputy Marshal Hollis came by the hospital today," Marin said quietly. "He said the federal marshal is arriving next week. They're going to convene a grand jury." Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. "And if the grand jury indicts? Then there'll be a trial, public, with witnesses and evidence and everything done according to law." She turned to look at him, her creekwater eyes reflecting the dying light. "Hollis thinks they have enough to proceed. The federal investigators found the bodies of the Cheyenne family buried in a ravine on Pritchard's land. They also found evidence that Sheriff Mason survived the mine shootout and gave a statement before he died. And there are others coming forward now, people who've been too scared to speak until they saw someone else stand up first." "Mason's dead?" Caleb felt a wave of grief wash over him. The sheriff had bought them time with his life, had died alone in that dark tunnel. He lived long enough to tell the truth. That counts for something. Marin squeezed his hand. Hollis also said that Jessup and 2 of his men were arrested trying to leave the territory. They're offering to testify against Pritchard in exchange for reduced sentences. This was the moment Caleb had been working toward, the justice he'd risked everything to achieve. So why did he feel so hollow? "What's wrong?" Marin asked, reading his expression with the ease of someone who'd learned to see past his walls. "I keep thinking about that family, Running Bear and his wife and their daughters." Caleb's throat was tight. Even if Pritchard hangs, even if justice is served, they're still dead. Those little girls will never grow up, never have families of their own, and nothing I do can change that. Marin was quiet for a moment, then shifted closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "No, you can't change what happened, but you can make sure it means something. That their deaths exposed a man who would have gone on killing, who would have destroyed more families, more lives. You gave them that. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's something. I wish I'd done more. Wish I'd stopped him that day instead of running. If you'd tried to stop him, you'd be dead too. And Pritchard would still be free." She pulled back to look at him directly. "You did the brave thing, Caleb. Not the easy thing, not the thing that makes you feel like a hero, but the thing that actually mattered. You survived, and you made sure the truth survived with you." He kissed her then, pouring all his gratitude and love and lingering guilt into that kiss. When they broke apart, the sun had fully set, and the first stars were emerging in the darkening sky. "When this is over," he said softly, "when the trial's done and Pritchard's been sentenced, what do you want to do?" Marin smiled, a small, secretive smile that made his heart skip. "I want to find that piece of land you talked about. Build that house, raise those horses." She paused, her expression turning serious. "And I want to marry you, Caleb Arden, if you'll have me." For a moment, Caleb couldn't breathe. He'd hoped, had dreamed, but hearing her say it made it real in a way that stole his words. "Is that a yes?" Marin asked, laughter in her voice now. "That's a yes," he managed. "That's 1,000 times yes." They sat together as full dark fell, making plans for a future that had seemed impossible just weeks ago, letting themselves believe that tomorrow might actually come. The grand jury convened on a cool morning in late September. Caleb testified for 4 hours, recounting every detail of what he'd witnessed that day on the prairie. The jury foreman, a gray-haired rancher with weathered hands and sharp eyes, asked pointed questions that cut through any attempt at evasion. Marin testified next, describing the attempts on Caleb's life, the violence of Pritchard's men, the terror of being hunted. Her clinical precision as a healer lent weight to her words, made them undeniable. Then came the federal investigators with their evidence. The location of the bodies,
Ballistics reports showing the bullets that killed the Cheyenne family came from a rifle registered to Samuel Pritchard, testimony from a surveyor who'd seen Pritchard arguing with Running Bear 2 days before the murders. Sheriff Mason's dying statement was read into the record, his words given weight by the sacrifice of his life. And finally, Raymond Jessup took the stand, a broken man seeking to save himself from the noose. He confirmed everything: the murders, Pritchard's orders to silence Caleb, the attempts on both Caleb's and Marin's lives. In exchange for his testimony, the prosecutor promised to seek life imprisonment instead of execution. The grand jury deliberated for less than an hour. They returned an indictment on 4 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Samuel Pritchard was arrested at his ranch 3 days later, brought to Helena in chains, and locked in the territorial prison to await trial. The trial itself began on a crisp October morning, the courthouse packed with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers. Pritchard sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, flanked by 3 lawyers from San Francisco, his expression one of controlled disdain. But as the prosecution built its case, day by day, witness by witness, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, that disdain began to crack. Caleb testified again, this time in open court, and the jury listened with rapt attention as he described what he'd seen. The defense tried to paint him as a disgruntled employee with a grudge, but Caleb's quiet, unflinching honesty made their attacks ring hollow. Marin testified to the attempts on their lives, and the jury saw in her not a hysterical woman, but a trained healer with nothing to gain from lying. The federal investigators presented their evidence with professional precision. Jessup testified again, his voice shaking as he described the orders Pritchard had given, the bodies he'd helped dispose of over the years, the reign of terror that had kept an entire county silent. The defense called character witnesses, prominent businessmen and politicians who swore to Pritchard's good name. But the prosecution countered with victims, families who'd lost land to Pritchard's schemes, workers who'd been injured through his negligence, people who'd been threatened and intimidated into silence. The trial lasted 2 weeks. When both sides finally rested, the judge gave his instructions to the jury, and they filed out to deliberate. Caleb and Marin waited in a small room off the main hall, too nervous to speak. Hours crawled by. Deputy Marshal Hollis brought them coffee and sandwiches they couldn't eat. As evening fell, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again, the air thick with anticipation. Pritchard sat stone-faced as the jury foreman stood. On the count of murdering Running Bear, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of murdering his wife, Dawn Song, guilty. On the counts of murdering their daughters, Little Sparrow and Singing Bird, guilty on both counts. The foreman continued through all the charges. Guilty, guilty, guilty. When it was done, Pritchard's mask finally shattered. He lunged from his seat, screaming threats and curses, before the bailiffs wrestled him back down. The judge called for order, his gavel cracking like gunshots. Sentencing was set for the following week. Caleb and Marin walked out of the courthouse into the autumn twilight, and for the first time in months, Caleb felt like he could breathe fully. The weight that had been crushing his chest since that day on the prairie finally lifted. "It's over," he said, hardly believing it. "It's over," Marin agreed, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but of relief and triumph, and the overwhelming release of tension held too long. They held each other on the courthouse steps as people milled around them, as journalists shouted questions they didn't answer, as the world continued its turning. For that moment, there was only the two of them, and the knowledge that they had done it. They had faced down evil and emerged victorious. A week later, Judge Morrison sentenced Samuel Pritchard to death by hanging for the murders and life imprisonment for the other crimes. The execution was scheduled for December. Caleb chose not to attend. He'd seen enough death, enough violence. Instead, when the day came, he and Marin were 30 miles outside Helena, looking at a piece of land that ran along a clear creek with good grass and a view of the mountains. "This is it," Caleb said, walking the property with the land agent trailing behind. "This is where I want to build." The land agent, a cheerful man named Peterson, beamed. "It's good land, Mr. Arden. Previous owner couldn't make a go of it, but that was due to poor management, not poor soil. With the right work, you could have a fine ranch here." Caleb looked at Marin, who was standing by the creek, one hand shading her eyes as she surveyed the valley. The autumn sun turned her copper hair to flame, and in that moment she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She turned and caught him watching, smiled that smile that was only for him. "What do you think?" she called. "I think this is home," he called back. They bought the land with money from the territorial government, compensation for their testimony and the danger they'd endured. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a start. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened into early winter, they began to build. Caleb hired workers from Helena, men who'd followed the trial and respected what he'd done. They raised the frame of a house, modest but solid, with windows facing east to catch the morning sun. Marion worked alongside them when she could, between her duties at the hospital. She'd been officially offered a position as Helena's first resident midwife and surgeon, a title that came with a small salary and a lot of respect. "I can do both," she told Caleb one evening as they sat by the fireplace in their half-finished house. "Work at the hospital and help build our ranch. Women have been doing 2 jobs since the beginning of time." "I know you can," Caleb said, pulling her close. "I just don't want you to have to." "I want to. The work matters to me. Bringing babies into the world, healing the sick, it gives my life purpose beyond just surviving." She looked up at him. "But this, what we're building here, this gives me joy. And I need both." He understood. He felt the same way about the horses he was planning to raise, about the land they were cultivating. Work that mattered, a purpose beyond himself, and someone to share it with. In late November, word came that the community of Cold Creek wanted to honor them. Despite the danger it had faced, despite the fear that had gripped it for so long, the town was finally free of Pritchard's shadow. A new sheriff had been appointed, businesses were opening again, and people were cautiously optimistic about the future. Caleb and Marion rode to Cold Creek on a bright Sunday morning, their horses' breath misting in the cold air. The town looked different somehow, lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from its buildings and streets. They were met by a crowd at the church, the same small church where Marion had first started attending services during Caleb's convalescence. The new sheriff, a young man named Carson, stepped forward. "Mr. Arden, Miss Hale," he said formally. "On behalf of the people of Cold Creek, I want to thank you for your courage, for your sacrifice, and for refusing to let fear silence the truth." There was applause, genuine and warm. People stepped forward to shake their hands, to offer thanks and blessings. The widow Henderson gave Marion a beautiful quilt she'd made, each square stitched with care. The blacksmith pressed a set of horseshoes into Caleb's hands, claiming they were lucky. Martha and Henry Brennan were there too, having made the trip from their farm. Martha hugged Marion fiercely, tears in her eyes. Henry shook Caleb's hand with quiet pride. "You did good, son," he said simply. "Real good." After the formal ceremony, Caleb found himself standing in front of the repaired cabin, where he'd hidden all those weeks ago. Someone had fixed the bullet holes, replaced the broken windows, painted the walls. It looked almost new. "The town council voted to make it a permanent residence for the midwife," Carson explained. "Figured it was only right, seeing as how Miss Hale started her practice here." Marion appeared at Caleb's elbow, her eyes taking in the transformation. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Will you come back?" Carson asked hopefully. "We could sure use a healer." Marion glanced at Caleb, a question in her eyes. He squeezed her hand, leaving the decision to her. "I'll come when I can," she promised. "Maybe once a month, to check on expectant mothers and anyone who needs care. But my home is with Caleb now, on our ranch." "That's more than we could ask for," Carson said. "Thank you." They stayed in Cold Creek that night, sleeping in the cabin one last time. It felt like closing a chapter, acknowledging where they'd been while looking forward to where they were going. "It's strange," Marion said as they lay in the darkness, the same bed where Caleb had recovered from his wounds. "This place was where everything changed, where we changed." "Where you saved my life," Caleb corrected. "Where we saved each other," she said. "I was lost when I came here, Caleb, drifting, trying to find meaning in my work but feeling empty inside. Then you appeared, bleeding and brave and refusing to give up, and suddenly I had a reason to fight for something beyond myself." He turned to face her, cupping her cheek with his palm. "You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive. Before you, I was going through motions, doing what needed doing, but never thinking about tomorrow. You made me want tomorrow. They kissed, soft and slow, a promise and a celebration all in one. The next morning, they rode back to their ranch, to the house that was nearly finished, to the life they were building together. On a cold December morning, with snow dusting the mountains and the creek running clear and cold, Caleb Arden stood at the front of Cold Creek's small church in a borrowed suit. His hands shook slightly as he watched the door at the back, waiting. The door opened and Marin Hale walked toward him. She wore a simple white dress that Martha Brennan had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her copper hair was loose around her shoulders, held back from her face with small white flowers. She carried no bouquet, needed no ornament beyond the radiant smile on her face. Caleb's breath caught. In all the beauty he'd seen in Montana's wide skies and endless plains, nothing compared to this moment, this woman walking toward him with love and trust shining in her eyes. The ceremony was simple, conducted by a traveling minister who'd heard their story and insisted on performing the service for free. Martha and Henry stood as witnesses, along with Deputy Marshal Hollis, who'd become a friend during the long weeks of testimony and trial. Do you, Caleb Arden, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? I do, Caleb said, his voice strong and clear. And do you, Marin Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? I do, Marin said, her eyes never leaving Caleb's face. They exchanged simple gold bands that Caleb had commissioned from the Helena goldsmith, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb pulled Marin into his arms and kissed her to the sound of applause and cheering from the small congregation. They celebrated with a modest meal at the boarding house, surrounded by the people who'd helped them survive, who'd believed in them when belief seemed foolish. Stories were told, toasts were made, and for a few hours the world was nothing but joy and possibility. As evening fell, Caleb and Marin rode back to their ranch, now truly their home. The house was finished, warm light glowing from its windows. They'd spent the previous week furnishing it with simple, sturdy pieces. A bed Martha had given them as a wedding gift, a table Caleb had built himself, chairs and dishes, and all the small necessities of daily life. They entered their home as husband and wife, and Caleb swept Marin into his arms, carrying her over the threshold with a laugh. "Welcome home, Mrs. Arden," he said. "Welcome home, Mr. Arden," she replied, kissing him soundly. They built a fire in the fireplace and sat before it, wrapped in blankets, watching the flames dance. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Marin asked, her head resting on Caleb's shoulder. "When I found you behind that boulder?" "Every day," Caleb admitted. "I think about how close I came to dying, how if you'd been 5 minutes later, or chosen a different route, or decided not to help a stranger, none of this would exist. But I didn't. I was exactly where I needed to be, exactly when I needed to be there." She tilted her head to look up at him. "I used to think life was random, that good and bad things just happened without reason. But now, I wonder if maybe there's a pattern we can't always see, a purpose to the timing of things. You think we were meant to find each other?" "I think we were meant to save each other," she said, "and everything that came after was us choosing to stay." Caleb kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Then I choose to stay. Every day, for the rest of my life, I choose you." "And I choose you," she whispered back. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, neither wanting to move, to break the perfection of the moment. Finally, Marin stirred, a small smile playing at her lips. "You know what the minister said to me before the ceremony?" "What?" "He said that marriage is easy when everything's going well. The real test is whether you can hold on to each other when everything's falling apart." She turned to face him fully. "We already passed that test, Caleb. We held each other through bullets and fear and pain. Everything from here is just living." "Just living," he echoed, marveling at the simple beauty of it. No more running, no more fear, no more looking over their shoulders. Just the everyday work of building a life together, of raising horses and healing the sick and watching the seasons turn. It was everything he'd never dared to hope for. They went to bed that night in their own house, in their own bed, as husband and wife. And as Caleb held Marin close, listening to her breathing slow and deepen into sleep, he thought about the long, impossible journey that had brought them here. From that desperate moment behind the boulder, blood seeping through his fingers and death riding toward him, to this moment of perfect peace and safety. From a stranger with a wagon and more courage than sense, to the woman who was now his wife, his partner, his future. The path had been brutal and terrifying, marked by violence and loss. But it had also been marked by extraordinary courage. Marin's fierce determination to save him, the sheriff's sacrifice, the Brennan's quiet heroism, and countless small acts of bravery from people who chose to stand up when standing up was dangerous. And in the end, justice had prevailed. Not the quick, clean justice of dime novels, but the messy, complicated, hard-won justice of the real world. Pritchard had faced consequences for his crimes. The truth had been told and believed. The innocent had been vindicated. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't bring back Running Bear and his family, couldn't undo Sheriff Mason's death or erase the scars, physical and emotional, that Caleb and Marin carried. But it was something. It was enough. Caleb closed his eyes and let himself drift toward sleep, secure in the knowledge that when he woke, Marin would be beside him, that they had tomorrow and the day after that, and all the days stretching out before them like the Montana prairie, vast and wild and full of promise. In the months and years that followed, their ranch grew. Caleb proved to have a gift for breeding and training horses, producing animals known throughout the territory for their strength and temperament. Marin split her time between the ranch and her medical practice, delivering babies and healing the sick with skill and compassion that made her legendary in her own right. They faced challenges, as all couples do, harsh winters that tested their resources, a bout of illness that swept through the valley, the everyday struggles of building something from nothing. But they faced them together, and each challenge overcome only strengthened their bond. They never forgot what they'd survived, never took for granted the miracle of their ordinary days. Every morning that Caleb woke beside Marin, every evening they spent on their porch watching the sunset, was a gift they'd earned through blood and courage and an unwavering refusal to give up. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the prairie wind sang through the grass and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, Caleb would hold Marin close and whisper the words that had become their private benediction. "It hurts," he would say, thinking of all they'd endured, all they'd lost, all the scars that would never fully fade. And Marin, his brave, beautiful, impossible wife, would pull him closer and answer with the words that had saved his life and given him a future. "Then let me hold you till it doesn't." And she would. And it would ease, and they would go on together. Two survivors who'd found in each other not just love, but the courage to keep choosing life, keep choosing hope, keep choosing each other, day after day after day. Their story became the stuff of local legend, the cowboy and the healer who'd brought down one of Montana's most powerful men. But for Caleb and Marin, it was simply their beginning. The story of how they'd met wasn't the point. The point was what they'd built in all the years after. A home filled with laughter and hard work, and the everyday magic of shared purpose. A refuge for those who needed healing. A legacy of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. And a love that had been forged in the crucible of survival and proven strong enough to withstand anything life threw at it. Some wounds, Caleb had learned, did heal stronger than before. Some hearts did too. And some loves, born in desperation and refined through trial, became unbreakable. This was their truth, their story, their life. And as the years passed and their hair grayed and their faces lined with the marks of time well spent, they held fast to each other and to the knowledge that they had already survived the worst the world could offer. Everything else was just the gift of living, 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 just the gift of